What has Christianity ever done for us? A lot of people are turned off to the Christian faith. We are in a post-Christian setting where people have said, we've already tried that, let's try to find something else. Christianity has been attempted here, but we've seen that it fails, and we can't go back to that again. Well, maybe we need to rethink things a bit more. Of course, we've touched on this question about religion, and I'll just be brief about this introduction here. Remember, religion poisons everything. Christopher Hitchens talks about how God is not great. Of course, the call to prayer from the minaret, Allahu Akbar, is the call to acknowledge that God is greater, than anything that we could put up against him. But Christopher Hitchens says, no, God is not great. Religion is the problem. And we've already talked about Martin Marty, who says that, well, what do you mean by religion? There are 17 different definitions to religion. And I've already reviewed some of these things. And we should add that everyone has a worldview. We've already talked about that. But we need to remember, too, that atheism itself has done a lot of poisoning. So it's not as though it's all those people who are religious who have done bad things, and atheists, they're squeaky clean. They have done everything right. Now, many people have done terrible things in the name of atheism, and we need to acknowledge that. And unfortunately, a lot of those new atheist sorts don't want to acknowledge anything having to do with bad things done in the name of atheism. They want to remove themselves from it rather than saying, yeah, those people call themselves atheists. I don't agree with the conclusions that they drew, but yeah, they were atheists, and that's just a blot on our name, so to speak, of atheist. When we talk about religion, we need to remember that not all religions are created equal. And when we were dealing with the religious pluralism question, we talked about how the Christian faith is distinct from these other faiths in that it is, rather than emphasizing what you need to do, it's emphasizing what Christ has done and living a life of gratitude in response to that. The Christian faith, if you want to put it this way, is a religion of gratitude. It's not a religion of performance. It's a religion of the one who has performed on our behalf, that we've been accepted not because of our performance, but through what Jesus Christ has accomplished. And that therefore we, as Paul said, make it our ambition to be pleasing to him. There's a difference between trying to be accepted by God and to be pleasing to God. Christ to take care of the acceptance part. Let's move forward and seek to live lives that are pleasing to God. But again, the Christian faith is very distinct from these other traditional religions in its emphasis on salvation by grace rather than self-salvation. We can also talk about bad things that have been done in the name of religion, in the name of God, and of course Jesus said that those sorts of things would be done. So but what may be helpful for us here is that when we look at people who live consistently Christian lives, often in hostile settings, I think we'll get a better picture of what to look for than calling oneself a Christian in a society, whether it's England or the United States, where it's easy to get away with calling yourself a Christian, but not really having to live up to that name. The Bible, of course, makes clear that we are all in need of God's grace, that we are sinful, fallen, fallible, flawed, but that God can still use our lives to bring about transformation, to spread the glory of God throughout the world. So what happens when people faithfully follow Jesus Christ? When they're consistently living out their message rather than wearing just the Christian label and nothing more? What we're going to emphasize here is how many of us in our culture are basically cultural trust fund kids. There have been hard-fought gains brought to Western civilization through courageous and dedicated Christians following Jesus. We're just sitting on top of wealth, taking it for granted, assuming that these sorts of structures are going to continue on, whereas what actually brought shape to those structures that we take for granted are slowly eroding, they're fading, they're falling. And what is going to replace them? What's going to fill the vacuum? So what we want to do is briefly talk about worldview and practice. We've touched on this a little bit. We're going to reinforce this with you all on the connections between worldview and practice and some of the disconnects. We'll also look at this matter of roots, shoots, and fruits. A good way to remember the structure of how civilizations are shaped. It doesn't begin just by passing laws or something. It's something much more fundamental. We'll talk about transformation in history, how faithful Jesus followers have shaped culture. And then we'll look at Christianity and the critics and how actually non-theistic scholars reinforce this theme of the impact of the Christian faith here and around the world. And again, I'm borrowing in that last section, just like I do from the atheists, the naturalists who actually reinforce the Christian faith here. When it comes to a look at history, we see a lot of atheists, agnostics, who actually reinforce the theme that the Christian faith has actually made a dramatic impact, that is the key factor, the X factor, that has brought about this kind of dramatic change in democracy and human rights and so forth. So let's talk about worldview and practice, connects and disconnects. We've touched a little bit on the ancient Near East. I'll talk a little bit about India and some of the mindset that we find there. Again, it's not as though you have to look far to see this. It's not as though I'm pushing hard on something that isn't evident to many. One activist and author and reformer, Kancha Ilaiah, has talked about how within Hinduism, there is no appreciation per se of a healthy man-woman relationship which is rooted in the concept of equality. We say, oh, all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, this self-evident truth and so forth. Well, in a place like India, not all are created equal. You have the caste system, of course, which divides people up, and you also have the male-female divide. Now, where does this thinking come from that this Indian himself recognizes about his own country, the lack of this concept of equality between male and female? Well, he points out, look at the deities within Hinduism and maybe you'll get a clue. He says we have the god Shiva, who insisted on entering the bathing arena of the goddess Parvati and did so by eliminating a child who was keeping guard at the open door. Lord Krishna stole clothes of women while they were bathing in the Yamuna River. He did so to tease them and for the pleasure of watching the beauty of their naked bodies. We hang miniature paintings of the same act in our homes proudly. The young men who grow up seeing this or listening to the story told in an amused tone are bound not to find such an act abhorrent. I actually spoke on this a few months ago, and some young man from India came up to me and he said, he found mention of these things offensive. And I said, well, I mean, it's not as though I'm quoting this as a Westerner. I'm quoting someone from inside the country, and he's highlighting these problems as someone just reflecting on these issues and what can be done about them. He said, well, Krishna, he grew up later on to be much more mature. This is in his youth phase. I said, well, why is it that people don't go beyond the youth phase and they focus on this and they refer to Krishna in this kind of Playboy-esque sort of manner? So you have that sort of a scenario that is reinforcing this treatment of women as objects. He mentions that our mythology tells us what a husband does is right, that his will is greater than the woman's. If a mythological hero is praised for his acts of killing, drinking, and fornicating with multiple women, it is glorification of such behavior. One Supreme Court judge in India, Ram Jethmalani, talks about the god Ram, after whom he's named, ironically, or I can say aramically maybe. He says, Ram was a bad husband. I don't like him at all. Now, what did Ram do? Well, he sent his virtuous wife, Sita, into exile because a washerman, or maybe a fisherman, slandered her. And so because Ram listened to him and wanted to be popular among the people, sent her into exile and basically betrayed his own virtuous wife. I think as you look at the language of the Hindu male gods and how they interact with female deities or women, they curse or strike them or use them as sexual objects. This is simply how the worldview within Hinduism has taken shape. And could it be that this theology is connected to this lesser value of women and the girl child? Well, we see this kind of gender side taking place, not just in China, that's its own issue, but also within Hinduism. One person writes about the 60 million missing women in India, largely through gender side. That if you have to choose between male and female, the male gets the nod and the female is aborted. So this is the sort of thing that's happening, that it's actually having dramatic social consequences as well in terms of the disproportion of male and female now in India. We've talked about the ancient Near East. I won't dwell on this for very long, but we've talked about the connection between the worldview, the gods and the pantheon and so forth, their activities of incest and bestiality and so forth, and how the people then would come to practice those things, how these things filtered their way into the law books, that there are certain acts of bestiality that were permissible in those law codes. And that in some of their literature, they talked about the fantasizing about incestuous relationships. So this is again, I'm not going to dwell on this beyond just showing you these slides on what I had earlier talked about when we looked at the Canaanite peoples. But let me just talk now a little bit about disconnect. So we've seen that there is this connection, and it's not hard to see how things fall out between the theory, the theology, and the practice within Hinduism. We talked about the Canaanite deities. But let's talk a little bit about the Western situation here, where there are some disconnects. Connection, disconnect here. Here's a quotation from Richard Dawkins, which I like to quote. Dawkins says, "As an academic scientist, I am a passionate Darwinian. Believing that natural selection is, if not the only driving force in evolution, certainly the only known force capable of producing the illusion of purpose which so strikes all who contemplate nature. But at the same time as I support Darwinism as a scientist, I am a passionate anti-Darwinian when it comes to politics and how we should conduct our human affairs." Theory, Darwinism, atheism, anti-Darwinism when it comes to practice. Well, thankfully, the Christian worldview doesn't have to pit one against the other, the worldview against the practice. But Richard Dawkins here is having to borrow from something that sounds strangely like a Christian worldview. Here's another one, John Searle. He asked this question, and we've touched on this a little bit. He says, "There is exactly one overriding question in contemporary philosophy. How do we fit in? How can we square this self-conception of ourselves as mindful, meaning-creating or meaning-affirming, free, rational, etc. agents with a universe that consists entirely of mindless, meaningless, unfree, non-rational, brute physical particles?" We take for granted, of course, our humanity. These are the sorts of things we were just talking about in the last session, that scientism has disenchanted the world. Everything is mechanistic, everything is deterministic, everything is predictable based on what has gone before, and that there is no free will, there is no imagination, etc. We're locked into this system, we're cogs in a wheel. But yet John Searle says, but we feel differently, that this can't be the way things are. How do we square this view of this kind of enchanted world view of our own selves as human, as moral, as having dignity and worth and so forth? How do we square this with the scientific vision? Well, this is his answer. He says, physical events can only have physical explanations, and consciousness is not physical, so consciousness plays no explanatory role whatsoever. If, for example, you think you ate because you're consciously hungry, or got married because you're consciously in love with your prospective spouse, or withdrew your hand from the flame because you consciously felt a pain, or spoke up at a meeting because you consciously disagreed with the main speaker, you are mistaken in every case. In each case, the effect was a physical event and therefore must have an entirely physical explanation. Stunning, isn't it? What we take for granted as what is obvious, intuitive, commonsensical, John Searle is saying you've got to deny that. Those things have to be explicable only in physicalistic terms. That is how we ought to operate. Notice this disconnect. This is how we operate, but yet there's something that tells us that there were more than just these things. So there is this, we've seen kind of a connect between a theory and a practice, but we can also see a kind of disconnect between what one proclaims, like a Richard Dawkins being this atheistic Darwinist, and how he lives as an anti-Darwinist when it comes to everyday life and social practice, but having to borrow from another worldview in order to sustain that kind of an anti-Darwinism. So, let's unpack how this worldview thing works. And we'll talk about roots, shoots, and fruits, and the impact of various model voices on cultures. A friend of mine, Tom Wolfe, has talked about how while all cultures are sick, some are sicker than others. So when we're talking about even, quote, Western civilization, there are a lot of things that are sick, a lot of things that are problematic, things that are falling apart, and we ought to recognize those things. But why are some cultures more change-prone instead of change-resistant? How does, for example, one change the mindset that diminishes or denigrates women or the girl child, or even that holds to a caste system? And we've talked about how merely changing laws isn't necessarily going to change a mindset. Can't change a constitution and everything is going to be just fine. In fact, the Roman writer Tacitus said that the more corrupt the republic, the more laws. It's a very pithy but very telling statement, isn't it? The more corrupt the republic, the more laws. Why is that? Well, when virtue, when character break down, all you're left with to keep order is laws and the military or the police to keep things under control. You used to be able to just shake hands and have an agreement, but we live in all sorts of paperwork and bureaucracy where you have to sign things away, you have to do things in triplicate in order to hold people to what they have agreed to do. But how do you change this sort of a mindset when you don't have that kind of culture, that character, and so forth in place? Something profound, something pervasive and transformative is going to be important. That is, a new voice needs to be listened to. Which brings me to the roots, shoots, and fruits imagery. Again, a friend of mine, Tom Wolfe, talks about having a world voice, which we could call the roots. That there is a spokesman or a spokesperson, maybe even a worshiped deity. Think of Jesus or Muhammad or Buddha or Shiva or Karl Marx, for that matter. These voices that we listen to that shape our thinking. So from those roots comes a worldview, a philosophy of life, a philosophical, quote, religious or intellectual group of precepts and outlook. Coming from the roots, organically connected, from that voice that we're listening to that informs, that gives us an orientation point, then grows into a worldview. And then that worldview, we can talk about a world venue, that is, places where we practice the worldview, the philosophy of life that has taken shape, the visible expressions of our own beliefs through concrete social customs and practices. Roots, shoots, and fruits. There is a connection, and we want to emphasize there is this connection between what the Christian faith has brought to the world, the impact that the gospel has had. Consider, say, the biblical voices in Genesis 1, where God creates man in his image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created him. A fundamental equality here. Jesus in Matthew 7:12 says, "In everything, therefore, treat people the same way you want them to treat you, for this is the law and the prophets." Well, you come to Hinduism. The Hindu voice, what's called the Book of Manu, says not all are created equal. You have a basic breakdown of persons into those who are worshipped as deities down to those who have no status in society whatsoever. From those who are the high priestly culture down to those who sweep excrement on the streets of India. The author of the Indian Constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, significantly burned the Book of Manu, this kind of Hindu text, which institutionalizes the caste system, which he called a holy lie. He burned it on Christmas Day, 1927. You get the connection. It's connected to Jesus, someone who brought a remarkable vision. His voice was loudly heard, but had not come to India to transform that society, to bring equality there. He says, Hindu society seems to me to stand in need of a moral regeneration that is dangerous to postpone. Notice that language of regeneration, some sort of transformation that is needed. There was a reformer in India in the 19th century, Jyotirao or Mahatma Phule, who studied at a Scottish mission school in the 1840s. So Jyotirao Phule referenced the person he considered the moral anchor of his own radical reforms against corruption, against the Brahmin system that was dominated by those who were higher up. He called Jesus the Bali Raja, the sacrifice king. He says, one great champion of the downtrodden, the holiest of the holy, the great sage and lover of truth, Bali Raja, came into this world. He said that followers of that Bali Raja came to India. Indeed, the Apostle Thomas, one of the disciples, came to India and preached and practiced the true teaching of their Messiah among the Shudras, or the backward castes here. They thus emancipated the Shudras from the unnatural and inhuman slavery that was imposed by the wicked Brahmins. Again, this is kind of an insider speaking about what he is seeing and the oppression that the caste system has brought. In fact, he wrote a book on slavery dedicated to the American people and written with great admiration for Abraham Lincoln. And in the beginning it says, dedicated to the good people of the United States as a token of admiration for their sublime, disinterested, and self-sacrificing devotion in the cause of Negro slavery, and with an earnest desire that my countrymen may take their noble example as their guide in the emancipation of their Shudra, or backward caste brethren, from the trammels of Brahmin thraldom. Interestingly, his wife, the mother of education in India, received a gospel of John from a missionary, a Scottish missionary as well, who, and this was the first book that she received, and it was the one that she wanted to read when she became literate, and so her husband taught her how to read after they were married. And she became the mother of education in India. Notice the trickle of the gospel coming to the Phules and how they see the message, the voice of Jesus is something that is for India. It is something that means transformation. It is something that means even redemption for the caste system to be turned over and revolutionized. So let's then, having this background of looking at the connects and disconnects and the roots, shoots, and fruits, let's now look at when people faithfully follow Jesus Christ, what actually happens. And as I intimated earlier, in the West, we're living off the fumes of a Christendom largely shaped by persons dedicated to living out the biblical message. We have inherited something like a house or a building that has been constructed and that has functioned and has been durable, which we have taken for granted. We inhabit it without thinking about how any of it came to be, how it came to be structured, how it makes sense. We just kind of step in and take its existence for granted. But I want to go back a little bit and track the transformation for us, to look at the transformation of culture early in the Christian era and then into the Middle Ages, and then the impact that the Protestant Reformation has had in bringing democracy, education, and moral reforms in the world. And then transformation in the modern era through science and bioethics and the emphasis on human rights. So let's unpack some of these things as we move forward. The transformation of culture, early Christian era and the Middle Ages. The Yale historian Wayne Meeks talks about how the first urban Christians were re-socialized through conversion. That is, they came to see the world in a new way. The world was now reconfigured through Jesus the Messiah. He talked about the intimacy of Christian groups as a welcome refuge, meeting in house churches, the emotion-charged language of family and affection, greeting one another as brother and sister in Christ, not master, slave, brother and sister. The image of a caring, personal God, the master symbol of the crucified Savior. What Tim Keller was talking about earlier. This is the fundamental, this is the picture that we have before us, a crucified Savior who is Lord of all, who gives himself for those who have rebelled against him. And so he says, Wayne Meeks says, these crystallized a believable picture of the way the world really, or seemed really to work. People started to see, no, this Roman system of oppression, this Roman honor and shame system that excludes and elevates some, but removes others from consideration. That's not the way to look at reality. Jesus Christ is the one who shapes reality. He is the one who is the Lord over reality. He is the one I'm going to follow, not this Roman system. So we have the earliest Christians of all social strata, master, slave, Jew, Gentile, male and female, exhorted to greet one another with a holy kiss. Can you imagine? Treating one another as family. They would eat together as equals at love feasts, followed by the Lord's Supper. No, not the slaves sitting in one portion of the house and the master and family elsewhere. They all sat together. They shared a meal as family in Christ. Calling one another brother and sister because they had been adopted by their heavenly Father through their crucified, self-sacrificing Master and Savior, Jesus Christ, who took the form of a slave. In the 2nd century epistle to Diognetus, we read this very remarkable affirmation of Christians and their remarkable lifestyle. They dwell in their own countries, but simply as sojourners. As citizens, they share in all things with others, yet endure all things as if foreigners. They have a common table, but not a common bed. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws and at the same time surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men and are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death and restored to life. They are poor, yet make many rich. They are in lack of all things and yet abound in all. They are dishonored and yet in their very dishonor are glorified. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that kind of testimony written about us? People of Kensington Temple, or wherever we happen to be attending. What a marvelous testimony that is. Even the Emperor Julian the Apostate, who was very hostile to Christians, talked about how these Christians were benevolent to strangers. They cared for the graves of the dead. He says the impious Galileans, that is, the followers of Jesus, support not only their own poor, but ours as well. And all men will see that our people lack aid from us. Something's got to be done. Those Christians are really outshining us, pagans. What a remarkable people, transformed lives. As we look at the history of Christianity early on, we see that there are moral and social reforms taking place. The outlawing of gladiatorial games, prohibiting child abandonment and infanticide, the creation of hospices, the creation of hospitals, motivated by Jesus' words, "I was sick and you looked after me." Missionary endeavors and church planting. St. Patrick, for example, in the 5th century, went back to Ireland where he was once a slave, ordained up to 1,000 priests, and 150 Celtic tribes became largely Christianized. The copying and preserving of manuscripts and the promoting of learning took place during this time. And there's this wonderful book, How the Irish Saved Civilization and Preserved Learning and Manuscripts and so forth. The establishing of universities and centers of learning, such as Oxford and the Sorbonne and University of Paris and so forth. Technological advancement, like horsepower, horseshoe, harnessing, water power, wheelbarrow, eyeglasses, clocks, and so forth. One scholar says the chief glory of the later Middle Ages was not its cathedrals or its scholasticism. It was the building for the first time in history of a complex civilization which rested not on the backs of sweating slaves or coolies, but primarily on non-human power, taking the burden off of human beings and channeling it into technological projects that saved the backs of human beings rather than broke them. The Oxford Symposium on Scientific Change in 1961 concluded that Christian beliefs provided the rationale and faith, the motive energy for Western technology. Again, the symposium that sought to account for these sorts of things and what motivated them. Let's talk about the transformation that came through the Protestant Reformation in particular. Democracy, education, and moral reforms. The democratizing roots of the Protestant Reformation. Starting in 1517, we're celebrating the 500th year anniversary this year of Martin Luther's posting his 95 Theses in Wittenberg. And the Protestant Reformation focused on these 3 core transformative values. The priesthood of all believers, that all of us who put our trust in Jesus Christ have access to God, that we can come boldly before the throne of grace and find mercy and grace to help us in our time of need. That we are a kingdom of priests, we are the new Israel, and that the hierarchical structures that kept people at a distance from God are no longer there, although perpetuated in, of course, Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. But the emphasis was just there on the priesthood of all believers, the accessibility that we have to God directly. Also the Bible in the vernacular, the right of every believer to study the scriptures for himself in his own language. Again, a remarkable breakthrough. Not that there weren't others doing it before then, but this was very significant, especially with the coming of the printing press that enabled this to be realized in larger numbers. And the goodness of vocations, the appropriateness of pursuing any honest vocation to the glory of God. So there wasn't this tiered system of, okay, if you're a pastor and you're a missionary, you're a first-class Christian. Okay, if you're a lawyer, you're maybe a stay-at-home mom, that's secular or that's inferior. No, all vocations, honest vocations, could be the means by which we bring glory and honor to God. Well, what did this do in terms of changing things in the world? One scholar by the name of Robert Woodbury wrote an award-winning piece called The Missionary Roots of Liberal Democracy in the American Political Science Review, an award-winning article. And he talks about the various democratizing gains for humanity through this Protestant Reformation's emphasis. He calls them conversionary Protestant Christians because they were, and who were responsible for these gains. This is what he lists. He says the development and spread of religious liberty, mass education, mass printing, volunteer organizations, most major colonial reforms, abolishing slavery, widow burning, foot binding, female circumcision, prepubescent marriage of girls, etc., and the codification of legal protections for non-whites in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Protestant missionaries bringing about these dramatic changes. Let's keep going. It says, areas where Protestant missionaries had a significant presence in the past are on average more economically developed today, with comparatively better health, lower infant mortality, lower corruption, greater literacy, higher educational attainment, especially for women, and more robust membership in non-governmental organizations. It keeps going. European Protestant missionaries from the 19th and early 20th centuries sought to protect indigenous peoples from abusive colonial powers. A lot of people associate missionaries with colonialism, but they're often in the middle, trying to bring harmony, bring equity and justice when the indigenous peoples were being abused by the colonial powers. So let's see them as distinct from the colonial powers rather than lumping them together, which is what a lot of people do. They were often selected as judges, these missionaries, to punish or reprimand military officials or magistrates in cases of murder, seizing land, and forced labor. They applied the same legal standards for whites and non-whites, and they documented colonial atrocities through detailed information and then later through photos. Robert Woodbury says that without Protestant missionaries and ministers, mobilizing mass protests would have been difficult. These missionaries helped create a type of cocoon in which nonviolent indigenous political movements could develop to press for democracy and decolonialization. And here's Woodbury's challenge. He says, look at any map. Where Protestant missionaries have been, there you will find more printed books and more schools per capita. You'll discover that in Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Asia, most of the early nationalists who led their countries to independence graduated from Protestant mission schools. You should see the documentation on this article. You can actually access it online. It's just remarkable. And a lot of people have challenged this. They've wondered about this thesis that Protestant missionaries were moral and social change agents, and this is actually held up under rigorous scrutiny. That it's been repeated, this theory has been repeatedly tested using all the available variables. Noted scholars like historian Philip Jenkins and sociologists Rodney Stark and Christian Smith find this very persuasive. And these are notable scholars. And indeed, the American Political Science Review required an additional 192 pages of supporting documentation before they would publish this article. And it also received several awards, as I've mentioned. Statistical evidence, he goes on to say, indicates a Protestant democracy connection, that Protestantism facilitated the development of modern representative democracy, and that stable democracy first emerged in Protestant Europe and British settler colonies. And by World War I, every independent, predominantly Protestant country was a stable democracy, with the possible exception of Germany. Less stable versions of democracy developed in Catholic areas with large Protestant and Jansenist, influenced by Augustine, Jansenist minorities such as France. And democracy lagged in Catholic and Orthodox parts of Southern and Eastern Europe where Protestants had little influence. A similar pattern has existed outside of Europe as well. But don't just take it from Robert Woodbury, who has written on this, but others like the atheist historian Niall Ferguson, a Brit who is now teaching at Harvard. But he talked about the connection between Protestantism and the strong work ethic as one of the 6 killer apps that propelled the West forward as a civilization. And there are the other things, science, modern medicine, property rights, free market, etc., that have actually been shaped by the strong Protestant influence. Now, I'm going to skip this section. Some people might say, what about Greek democracy? What about the Renaissance? What about the Enlightenment? Weren't these actually bringing us democracy? Didn't these have the influence? Not Christians. And basically, as we look at this, we can dismiss Greece as being the cradle of democracy. It's nothing like ours. They had basically slaves that you're born that way. That's just how you're made. You're just an animated tool, that sort of a thing. And there's also this disgust with manual labor by these philosophers. But as one philosopher said, the Greek world was fundamentally an aristocratic one, that the Greek city-state was founded on slavery, so it wasn't democracy as we know it. Some men are born to command, others to obey, which is why the Greek political life accommodates itself easily to the notion of slavery. Again, just briefly, Renaissance. The Renaissance was not some atheistic movement. People talk about Renaissance humanism. Humanism was like the humanities. That's what it was. It was a curriculum. It wasn't some sort of atheistic understanding of reality, because the people who were dominant figures in the Renaissance identified themselves as Christians, although they used many pagan sources for literary and aesthetic purposes. They were members of churches, this noted Renaissance scholar says. In fact, the French historian Jacques Barzun says that these Renaissance humanists remained deeply religious, and their references to pagan mythology, history, and geography were no more theological compromise than that of the Puritan poet John Milton, who did the same. It's basically that sort of mindset. So keep that in mind. What about the Enlightenment? Again, people who were leaders in the Enlightenment had actually been shaped by Protestantism themselves. So we can't easily separate the Enlightenment influence from the backdrop of Protestantism and often Calvinism that had shaped their thinking. We can talk, again, this historian, Stephen Hopgood, talks about the post-Enlightenment use of human rights has been the secularization of its biblical roots. Humanism, the cultural precondition for human rights, was a secular replacement for the Christian God. Let me go on into this section now of the transformation in the modern era. We looked at the early church and the Middle Ages. We've seen something of of what took place post-Reformation, and now we have in the modern era, through the Christian influence, the development of science, bioethics, and human rights. So, modern science, the pillars of modern science, believed in the Bible. They believed in design. They believed in the possibility of miracles. Newton, Kepler, Copernicus, Galileo, and so forth. These were people who were Bible believers, and they brought about a great influence. They shaped modern science. J.J. Thomson of Cambridge University had placed over his door in the Cavendish Laboratory the verse, "Great are the works of the Lord. They're studied by all who delight in them." Paul Davies says this, he's a noted writer in science, says, "Science began as an outgrowth of theology, and all scientists, whether atheists or theists, accept an essentially theological worldview." So like it or not, your viewpoint of science is shaped by a biblical worldview in which we are made in the image of a rational God who has put together a rational universe that can be studied and understood, that we can detect patterns, that there is a correspondence between what goes on in our minds and the world the world out there, that we can actually understand it, that there is this compatibility, so to speak, between the two. Bioethics. Daniel Callahan, a founding father of the bioethics movement, says, "When I first became interested in bioethics in the mid-1960s, the only resources were theological or those drawn from within the traditions of medicine, themselves heavily shaped by religion." And I could quote other people here, but let me move on to human rights, which is, of course, pronounced in our era and I think is worth exploring. The Declaration of Independence makes this connection between God and human rights, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they've been endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and understood in its classical sense, not this crass hedonism, but well-being and virtue, as Aristotle captured it. France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, these rights are affirmed in the presence and under the auspices of the Supreme Being. Again, notice this connection, God and human rights. Even the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights talks about the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. All humans are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Well, the Harvard scholar Marianne Glendon asks, well, what was behind the United Nations Declaration? She says that the chief movers seeking to create a new world order in the wake of Nazi and Japanese atrocities in the Second World War were primarily church coalitions and individual Christian leaders who worked closely with some Jewish rabbis. They shaped the United Nations Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It is fundamentally a Christian document. The human rights scholar Max Stackhouse of Princeton University said intellectual honesty demands recognition of the fact that what passes as secular Western principles of basic human rights develop nowhere else than out of the key strands of the biblically rooted religion. I love this quotation by the historian and author Tom Holland, who confesses why I was wrong about Christianity. Now notice the connection here between the world voice and the worldview, and then the practice that comes from that, the roots, shoots, and fruits. He says, the longer I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, the more alien and unsettling I came to find it. It was not just the extremes of callousness that I came to find shocking, but the lack of sense that the poor or weak might have any intrinsic value. As such, the founding conviction of the Enlightenment that it owed nothing to the faith into which of its most of which of its greatest figures had been born, increasingly came to seem to me unsustainable. Every sensible man, Voltaire wrote, every honorable man must hold the Christian sect in horror. Yet Voltaire, in his concern for the weak and oppressed, although not his own children, whom he dropped off as ciphers in orphanages, was marked more enduringly by the stamp of biblical ethics than he cared to admit. We preach Christ crucified, St. Paul declared, unto the Jews a stumbling block and unto the Greeks foolishness. He was right. Nothing could have run more counter to the most profoundly held assumption of Paul's contemporaries, Jews or Greeks or Romans. The notion that a God might have suffered torture and death on a cross was so shocking as to appear repulsive. Familiarity with the biblical narrative of the crucifixion has dulled our sense of just how completely novel a deity Christ was. In the ancient world, it was the role of gods who laid claim to ruling the universe, to uphold its order by inflicting punishment, not to suffer it themselves. Today, even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is the principal reason why, by and large, most of us who live in post-Christian societies still take for granted that it is nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. And this is indeed what the critics of Christianity confess. They recognize that the Christian faith has indeed had this dramatic impact in history. I'll just give you a few quotations here, and then we'll try to wrap things up here in this final section. But this is probably the leading philosopher on the European mainland, Jürgen Habermas, who says Christianity has functioned for the normative self-understanding of modernity as more than just a precursor, just happened beforehand, or a catalyst, something that may have done something and gotten some ideas going. He says egalitarian universalism, from which sprang the ideas of freedom and a social solidarity, of an autonomous conduct of life and emancipation, the individual morality of conscience, human rights, and democracy, is the direct heir to the Judaic ethic of justice and the Christian ethic of love. It's an atheist speaking here. This legacy, substantially unchanged, has been the object of continual critical appropriation and reinterpretation. To this day, there is no alternative to it, and in light of current challenges of a post-national constellation, we continue to draw on the substance of this heritage. Everything else is just idle postmodern talk. That's an atheist for you, speaking in defense of the history of Christianity and its impact. Jacques Derrida, an atheist thinker, he says, today the cornerstone of international law is the sacred. What is sacred in humanity? You shall not kill. He says, in that sense, the concept of crime against humanity is a Christian concept, and I think there would be no such thing in the law today without the Christian heritage, the Abrahamic heritage, the biblical heritage. The agnostic philosopher Luc Ferry says that the Christian idea of human equality was unprecedented at the time and one to which our world owes its entire democratic inheritance. Again, these are not friends of the Christian faith in any worldview sense, but here they are speaking. I'm going to skip ahead. Here's the agnostic political scientist Günter Levy, who says, adherents of a naturalistic ethic are not likely to produce a Dorothy Day or a Mother Teresa. Dorothy Day, the Catholic reformer. Many of these people love humanity, but not individual human beings with all their failings and shortcomings. They will be found participating in demonstrations for causes such as nuclear disarmament, but not sitting at the bedside of a dying person. An ethic of moral autonomy and individual rights, so important to secular liberals, is incapable of sustaining and nourishing values such as altruism and self-sacrifice. Notice what's going on here. A lot of those protesters for nuclear disarmament and so forth, they're the ones who are benefiting from those who have sacrificed so much in the name of the Christian faith, the altruism, the self-sacrifice. It's easy to love humanity in general, but not your neighbor who is dying next door. Malcolm Muggeridge talked about much righteous endeavor undertaken by Christians when he himself was an agnostic in Africa and India. He says, I never, as it happens, came across a hospital or orphanage run by the Fabian Society, the Socialist Society, or a humanist leper colony. It was just the Christians doing stuff. Here's one remarkable testimony by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation journalist Brian Stewart. He says, I've found that there is no movement or force closer to the raw truth of war, famines, crises, and vast human predicament than organized Christianity in action. And there is no alliance more determined and dogged in action than church workers, ordained and lay members when mobilized for a common good. It is these Christians who are right on the front lines of committed humanity today, and when I want to find that front, I follow their trail. It is a vast front stretching from the most impoverished reaches of the developing world to the hectic struggle to preserve caring values in our own cities and towns. I have never been able to reach these front lines without finding Christian volunteers already in the thick of it, mobilizing congregations that care and being a faithful witness to truth and the primary light in the darkness, and so often the only light. Notice this, he used to be an atheist or a skeptic. He says, now I came to this admiring view slowly and reluctantly. At the start of my career, I'd largely abandoned religion, for I too regarded the church as a rather tiresome irrelevance. What ultimately persuaded me otherwise, and I took a lot of persuading, was the reality of Christianity's mission, physically and in spirit, before my very eyes. I'm often asked if I lost belief in God covering events like Ethiopia, then called the worst hell on earth. Actually, like others before me, it was precisely in such hells that I rediscovered religion. I saw so many countless acts of human love and charity, total respect for the most forsaken, for all life. A few closing comments here. The Christian faith's positive historical impact in addressing and eradicating evils doesn't by itself prove that the Christian faith is true. We've already talked about the case that can be made for God's existence and so forth, for the resurrection of Jesus and so forth. We have good reasons for that. But it's important to remember that the watching world needs to see Christ followers live transformed and transforming lives. Jesus says, by their fruit you will know them. And so the telling question here is, to whose world voice do we want our children listening? Karl Marx or Krishna, Muhammad or Mao, or Jesus of Nazareth? Whose life do we want them emulating? The good news of Jesus, of God who steps into our world, sharing in our pain and suffering and misery, is indeed profound and transformative. Again, as Tom Holland said, the notion that a God might have suffered torture and death on a cross was so shocking as to appear repulsive. Familiarity with the biblical narrative of the crucifixion has dulled our sense of just how completely novel a deity Christ was. Rodney Stark, who has written about these sorts of things, about the impact of the Christian faith in history, back in 2006 identified himself as an agnostic. He teaches at Baylor University, and I wrote to him in 2011 and I asked him, where do you stand in your pilgrimage today? And he said this, he says, I basically wrote myself into the Christian faith. He said he had come to see the remarkable impact that the gospel had had in history, and that this reality gripped him so much that he gave his life to Christ, that the theory and the practice fit together. It wasn't just a coherent worldview, this great world voice, but it filtered down into the shaping of a worldview that would shape a civilization and beyond. And it was shaped by people who lived out their lives in a transformed way as faithful followers of Jesus Christ. Let me come back to India, where we began. I talked about some people who live in the very bottom of the caste system, having no caste at all, and doing things like cleaning excrement. The Dalit, those who have no caste, are engaged in cleaning up human excrement and dumping it. There's one testimony of a woman who said, the first day when I was cleaning the latrines and the drain, my foot slipped and my leg sank in the excrement up to my calf. I screamed and ran away. Then I came home and cried and cried. I knew there's only this work for me. Can you imagine that being your life work? Cleaning up excrement? Because that is what you've been consigned to. That is your karma because of what you did in a previous life, and now you're getting it. And no one should help you, because if they do, then they're going to compromise their own karma in the next life. And don't try to improve yourself, because this is what you deserve. And if you try to improve yourself in this life, then you're going to compromise your karma in the next life. So it becomes a vicious cycle. Well, my friend Tom Wolfe, whom I've mentioned, he's lived in India, and he knows someone who did exactly this kind of work. He was sweeping excrement, human excrement, on the streets of some Indian city. But he heard the message about a God who has made all human beings in his image, that there is no fundamental difference within the human race, that all are made in the image of God, and that this God sent his Son into the world to rescue humanity, to bring all human beings into his family. This gospel message so transformed him that he would eventually come to study at Oxford University to get his doctorate. And he would sum up his testimony in this nutshell. He would say, because of Hinduism, I used to sweep sheet. But because of Jesus, I went to Oxford University.